Donc, notre prochaine invitée est Filipa Ramos, qui est écrivaine, curatrice, et ses recherches se traduisent par des textes spéculatifs et théoriques, des conférences, des publications qui portent sur la manière dont l'art aborde l'écologie et favorise les relations entre les questions de nature et de technologie. Elle prône souvent l'abandon des approches anthropocentriques dans les arts et les sciences humaines. Parmi le nombre innombrable d'activités, de conférences, de choses qu'elle a faites, elle est chargée de cours à l'Institut Art, Gender, Nature, FHNW à Bâle, où elle dirige des séminaires du Master Art et Nature. Elle organise avec Lucia Pietreusti la manifestation The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, la forme d'un cercle dans l'esprit d'un poisson. Et son prochain livre, The Artist as Ecologist, sera publié par Lund Humphreys en 2024. Et donc j'ai vraiment le plaisir d'accueillir Filipa, que je remercie d'être avec nous.
Merci beaucoup Martin. J'ai dit 2 mots en français et après je change en anglais parce que sinon ça serait drôle, je dirais. Merci Martin et merci Maria pour cette invitation et merci aussi à toute la Fondation L'Humain. Quand Martin m'a invité, au début j'ai dit non, je peux pas, je suis malade, j'ai beaucoup de choses à faire, je ne peux pas. Et Martin, très gentiment, a insisté, on a eu une très belle conversation au téléphone. Et je remercie beaucoup pour cet enthousiasme parce que je suis ravie d'être ici et de pouvoir ajouter mes mots à cet ensemble très beau des gens qui ont des intérêts, des passions en commun. And I switched to English because, as I mentioned, my French is it's very nice for a coffee table, but it doesn't allow me to have the tools to continue thinking in language. And what I'm coming here to speak about is about it's about the person who became a sort of a love of my life, an artist called Simone Forti, and it's to present and to bring a case study of an artistic and a poetic response of a possibility of our relationship to wildlife, particularly to animals, and going through the work that she has been developing as a dancer and a choreographer and an artist throughout these last decades. And I will. So, zoos make animals visible. By exhibiting, editing, and framing the living beings they detain, they activate specific modes of looking and being looked upon that transform the status of animals, conditioning the ways in which they are conceptualized and considered. In this, zoos rely on exhibitionary traditions that are historically, materially, and ideologically aligned with forms of public exhibition and entertainment, such as the theater, the museum, and the cinema, sites of performance, exhibition, and experimentation. Zoos create worlds of their own, just like with an exhibition or a film. They are spaces of desire, of learning and of projection and identification associated to the observation of moving bodies, but not without problems. For some time now, I've been investigating how the conditions of exhibiting animals in zoological gardens create specific modes of observation and inquiry, not only for viewers during their leisure time, but also for artists who choose this environment as a source of intellectual, affective, and creative input. Considering contemporary art as an exhibitionary practice parallel to that of the zoo is, I hope here, allowing me to think the exhibitionary apparatus beyond art and exhibition studies, allowing me to understand, from a critical perspective, how our artistic and zoological displays feed and constitute one another in entangling living beings, people and not, infrastructure and optical devices, and to test art's capacity to dismantle physical and ideological systems of separation of humans, in particular in such conservative site of taxonomic reinforcement and exhibitionary violence as the zoo. This because the zoo is a place that, like few others, reveals the complex relationship the Western humanity has established with that difficult concept that is nature, and Gregory already spent quite some time there, and it creates the appropriate conditions to discuss and problematize the tensions that exist between entertainment and exhibition, science and preservation, permanence and obsoleteness. In this context, I'm coming here to share my research on a Germinal artist, Simone Forti, whose video, drawing, and dance pieces attest to how she spent time with animals at the zoo. I looked at her work with the desire to understand what led her to the zoo and how she responded to it, coming to comprehend that her unusual optics and language propose different visions and viewpoints that trigger effective and transformative drives towards such a troubled place. Simone Forti, for those maybe who are not familiar with her, she doesn't fit in pigeonholes. She's Italian and North American, she's a dancer and a visual artist, she's a writer and a poet, she's a choreographer and an improviser. Her work is playful and serious, conceptual and experimental, metaphorical and concrete. For the last 60 years, Simone has been examining the world through movement, which is her medium and her matter. Movement has allowed Simone to understand how bodies come together and intuitively negotiate each other's positions, weights, and functions. This is the case of the collective human mountain formed by Huddle, which this is a picture of taken in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in 1982. One of the most famous performed of her dance constructions, a series of instruction-based pieces she developed in the early 1960s. Curious about the movement and morphology of other species, Simone conducted plenty of animal observation studies, epitomized by the choreographic work Sleepwalkers from 1968, in which she reenacts and performs the behavior of various creatures. This is when she first performed it in a gallery in Rome called L'Attico in 1968. While conceptualizing the dance state, a concept she coined in the early 1970s to define physical movement made in a state of enchantment, she connects the word chanting and enchanting and thinking about the connection between chanting and dancing in the state of enchantment. Simone led workshops and collaborative experiments that added a new chapter to the history of improvisation. Her large group piece, Planet, from 1976, this is the poster that was announcing the piece, brings together 40 performers that execute an unorthodox vocabulary of movement, which incorporates nature-inspired themes and postures of dance enchantments. Later on, she danced the news. We're actually doing a program during Art Basel Film, a whole evening dedicated to her news dancing. In case you're around, you're very welcome. The news animation ongoing series that she started in 1985 displayed a unique embodiment of politics. This is one of the news. It's called Zoom and News, and it's from 2013. Through them, she establishes a political, bodily relationship with newspaper sheets and the news they bear, reading them while enacting some of their statements. In the early 1990s, she moved to Vermont, where she danced a gardening journal, drawing on her intimate contact with rurality. How to explain what I learned from the snow, from the compost bin, from the stars? On reaching into the dirt from the potatoes, myself dives into my fingers, and I am the dry, crumbly ground, she wrote during this period. In 2001, almost 2 decades ago, she moved to Los Angeles, her childhood city, where she has been living ever since. And this is one of her earlier pieces. It's called Onion Walk, and I consider it the first choreography she made. She placed an onion on top of a bottle in 1961, and it was the slow movement of the onion flourishing and losing the weight distribution of water that led to the choreography of the onion. And therefore, it's a piece that has a non-anthropocentric relationship to movement and to time, to the passing of time. Simone has been incorporating animal and vegetal movement studies throughout her entire career, expressed in a myriad of ways that range from poems, drawings, choreographic pieces, performances, and video pieces. Particularly relevant were the close animal observation times, as the artist Robert Morris, who was her former husband, named her practice of spending time looking at and performing with animals, which offer very moving and key case studies on how a balanced relationship between poetry, pragmatism, care, and experimental observation can present novel models of relating to a site that incarnates as many environmental conundrums as that of the zoo. Those animal observation times were crucial for the role that Simone played in the reconceptualization of dance that was generated by a new generation of choreographers, artists, and performers who, from the 1960s onwards, questioned the tradition of Western theatrical dance and its affiliation with both highbrow theater and popular spectacle. Resisting the frontal framing of conventional dance environments and their reliance on the stage and on the theatrical space, while expressing the influence of sculpture and their interest in triggering physical relationships on spectators, she expressed how, quoting, "I'm much more comfortable in a gallery. I don't like to be frontal. I like to be three-dimensional. It just feels different, much more live. A stage is so frontal, it might as well be a photograph. I like it when we're all in the same space, so viewers can identify with what they see. They just don't look at something outside of themselves." Indeed, she responded to this desire for change in dance by incorporating gestural patterns, movements, and sounds from the natural world, as is this case of this duck dance in the early 2000s that she was performing just outside of her house in LA. It was largely outside dance and the artistic realm that Simone found inspiration, as though a reform of dance required a reform of the human. Simone's practice of spending time looking at and performing with animals allowed her to surpass Western humanist-driven canons and instead to locate postures, rhythms, and spatial configurations that proposed holistic, harmonic, and end-mediated approaches to dance. By looking at and executing animal movements, registering them through drawings and written descriptions, and recording them with a video camera, she contributed to the invention of new dance. In the process, she also contributed to bringing the animals she was documenting, engaging with, and interpreting closer to audiences. By turning her body into an apparatus of mediation between the bodies of the animals and the bodies of audiences, Simone exposed the classical sites of spectacle of nature, namely the Zoological Garden and the Natural History Museum, to dance and art, and vice versa. The spaces of exhibition and confinement became part of the spaces of performance. This temporality is also merged. The movements and situations of these animals could have happened a month, a year, or a decade ago, but they kept happening anew each time they were performing. By carefully observing the actual performance of the spectacle of enclosure that is the zoo, and by participating in it, Simone's approach contributing to challenge the above-mentioned naturalized division in which an environment such as the Zoological Garden reinforces via its logics and configuration. Despite being an institutionalized system that provides access to unique visions and learning experiences of the world, the logics and legitimacy of the zoo were questioned by her depictions and interactions. Her drawings often include physical traces of confinement, cages and bars, and behavioral traces too, as she depicts the animals' movements in response to the limited space they live in. In some of her choreographic pieces, Simone uses her own body and the space she is given to express how those are not, for instance, bears roaming free in the forest or flamingos flying across the water, but animals who were forced to live in the tight spaces of confinement. Simone's animal pieces were initiated by her desire to discover the anatomy, the movement, and gestures of the human body in an evolutionary connection to other animals. She was obsessed in understanding why the legs of a frog were lateral and how the human legs were like this, for instance. And this interest in understanding the anatomy of this area of the body led her to make a series of choreographies and exercises to understand how one led to the other. Interconnecting movement and anatomy studies with behavioral research, she followed two main references, which were important for the elaboration of her dance and performance pieces. In work that concerned the correlation between an artistic practice and the investigation of human and animal locomotion, Simone looked at the work of pioneer motion photographer Edward Muybridge, whose photographic studies, made at the end of the 19th century, offered a remarkable example of how to combine artistic inputs and anatomical research. Her studies did not limit themselves to the interpretation of animal movement and experimentation in the human body. Indeed, she also revealed a strong interest for the relationship between physical and sensorial expression and the mind and consciousness of individuals and groups. For these studies, she was inspired by the research of naturalist Konrad Lorenz, in particular by his work on the perception and communication of gray-like goose, like you see these ones here, and jackdaws. Jackdaws are small corvids, like small crows, basically, which made its way, it's nice that when one mimics an animal, a hand becomes a crow, in a way, which made its way into her improvisation piece, Jackdaw Songs, and this is the invitation of the original performance of Jackdaw Songs, and in her exploration of non-verbal communication. These studies both propelled in an understanding of her own body, of her locomotion possibilities from a different non-human point of view, and a radical reconceptualization of dance that integrated non-human, animal, vegetal aspects into it. Non-human influences helped Simone to help modern dance to transition into what was called new dance. Often, Simone Forti is associated to what is also known as postmodern dance. It's a term that she's not very comfortable with, and she generally feels more comfortable to the idea of new dance, which is closer to the concept of new music, for instance. She expressed a desire to become, quoting, a vertebrate among others, which reveals the sense of horizontal, non-hierarchic relationship with other animals that she aims at instating, the human as an animal, as special and unique as all others. This implies a transition from an existential, historical, and philosophical narrative in which the human is considered unique to one where togetherness is achieved. Having spent her childhood going to the zoo with her father and her sister, so Simone comes from an Italian family from Tuscany, from Prato, close to Florence, and they escaped from Italy during fascist Italy to the United States, and they ended up living in LA. And so she lived in LA, she grew up in LA, and when she was young, her father would used to take her and her sister to the zoo. And then in the late 1960s, she goes back to Italy. She spends quite some time in Rome. She rents a flat very close to the Zoo of Rome, and she starts going to the zoo very regularly. So in the late 1960s, Simone returns to the zoo to look at bears, seals, flamingos, and elephants. She visits the urban areas in Rome where stray cats live to photograph their presence among the ruins of classical antiquity. I love this photo. It's probably one of the, it's the only photo I've ever seen of Simone with a skirt and with a mini skirt. And I think it's very interesting that I think the lion is very uncomfortable being there and being there to be taking a photo, but Simone, if you know photos of her, she's always with like large clothes and like clothes for training, or very comfortable clothes. And here it's funny that I think she might be very uncomfortable also with this mini skirt. And here is an image of the cats of Rome that she photographed during this time that she was there. She spends time studying the anatomy. Martin, j'ai besoin de 100 minutes. Okay, I just received a notice here. She spends time studying the anatomy of various vertebrates and understanding how it translated into her own body. This is rendered into an iconic piece called Sleepwalkers, which is based on the performance of 4 distinct figures done sequentially: flamingo, bear, seaweed, and water strider. Each conveys the movement of a particular life form. The figures are executed by a single performer, originally herself, with no accompanying music. So there's no sound apart from the sound of the performer. The first movement, the flamingo, enhances the verticality of the animal's slender body. Here's an image of the flamingo piece being performed by a long-time collaborator of Simone called Claire Filmont, at the moment where Simone was not traveling to Europe anymore. It was performed during the first event that Martin mentioned in his introduction of an ongoing research project that I lead together with Serpentine curator Lucia Pietroiusti, and that we started also thanks to the trust of Hans Ulrich Obrist, who's here in the audience, and I thank for trusting this crazy project that continues to exist. And Claire Firmont went to the reptile room and performed Simone's Sleepwalkers, and this is the flamingo pose, the first one. And the first movement, Simone says, was inspired by the flamingos. I watched them tuck their head under one wing and standing on one leg, going to sleep. It seemed fantastic, that complete abandon, that easy, alert equilibrium on one leg. I was trying to go to sleep standing up. The second movement corresponds to the bear. Standing up with both feet on the ground, Simone bends forward, leaning her hands on the ground as though she was on all her fours while also standing. She swings her head and shoulders in a pendular movement, laterally and continuously from one side to the other. This is a picture when she was at LA in artist residency in 2010. The third movement doesn't relate to an animal, but to seaweed that is caught in the surf. Lying on the floor, arms and legs stretch out, she rolls from one side to the other of the space at a slow but steady rhythm, following a straight line. The fourth movement is the water strider, and a tribute to these insects. You know, I bet there are some insects here in the lake. These little insects that stand on top of a lake and that walk on water, benefiting from the surface tension of water. Lying on the floor, her hands and feet sustain the rest of the body in a plank, and she occasionally hops front and sideways. Sleepwalkers' movements aren't extraordinary or exuberant. They are down-to-earth exercises, as with much of her work. She executes them with the effortlessness of a body that, while attempting an unusual form of locomotion, does not exhibit the pompous virtuosity of a body trained to classical dance. Simone maintains that in Sleepwalkers, it is not how a flamingo would sleep, but it is how I would sleep standing up, or at least how I would try to sleep. She's not trying to mimic or copy the body and movement of the animal, but to integrate the act of sleeping within her own body. Not to sleep like a flamingo would, but to sleep standing up like a woman would. So she bypasses mimicry in this, and she's not trying to compensate for evolutionary or biological differences that distinguish her body from the body of the flamingo, no? This relationship she establishes is one of possibility. She's not resembling a flamingo and not sharing fundamental physiognomic traces with it, but woman and flamingo can still have an experience of sleeping vertically that is that of kindred. Sleepwalkers reveals the vulnerability of a body that accepts to expose itself to public exhibition, of moving in an unusual and in a strange manner. This is particularly striking in her last executions of it, as in December 2016 at the New York International Studio and Curatorial Program in New York. And I'm going to show you a short video of it. For the past years, Simone has been suffering from Parkinson's disease, which causes her head and her hands to tremble. By accepting to publicly expose herself to a series of non-choreographed, improvised exercises in becoming other, and the practice of embracing the movement of another life form, she turns the vulnerability that this situation entails into its most compelling, defining feature, in particular because it's the expressive nature of the trying body that emerges in an otherwise non-expressive performance. There's a lot of light, but I don't know if you can see it. Yeah? I find it particularly moving that her Parkinson stops while she's dancing, as if she's possessed by dance. While developing such a system of attunement and syntony, she becomes this woman with flamingo, bear, seaweed, and water strider. She develops an experimental system of being with another, requesting her body to move and act in coexistence, to be exposed to sharing a space of embodiment, at once familiar and not. She lets herself be moved by her subjects of interest, gives them a chance to be interesting and curious, and even to be curious about her, when she engenders simple modes of interacting and communicating with them, reverting the subject-object dualism that the exhibitionary system of the zoological garden normalizes. In this exercise of exportation and adaptation of the conditions of the zoological garden to the set of contemporary art and dance, she manages to go beyond the limits of empathy towards a form of tacit request for a commitment to reorganization and redistribution of affects. Indeed, she has often revealed a propensity to establish horizontal, equal relationships between different beings and forms, and to have a conception of the fluid boundaries between what constitutes a person, an animal, a living form, and an object. And this is more than a mere poetic, fictional and freedom, for it reveals her resistance to the naturalized divisions established during modernity between the living and the inanimate, and to the taxonomic impositions and classifications that differentiate human from animal, vegetal from mineral. Bypassing these distinctions, she exposes the intertwined relationships of the life she meets, proposing a meaningfulness that is at once clear and opaque, accessible and unreachable, meaningful and beyond meaning, united and fragmented. Her rigorous methodology of observation and documentation, the consistency with which she experiments with her own body, what she observes, the ways in which she integrates the spatial constraints imposed on the animals, and her poetic modes of expressing encounters and impressions, shape her entire body of work into a manifesto for an awareness of the features and rights of nature. And as a conclusion, these processes define her singular approach to being animal. Her consistent depictions render animals visible, while also making visible the intrinsic conditions of visibility that have been imposed upon them. Thank you.
Merci, Filipa. Thank you, Filipa, for this talk. It's especially beautiful, I have to say, to see the videos of Simone Forti dancing at the end of her life, and this kind of like connection between the fluidity of the movement and Parkinson's. It really has a very, very striking effect. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Il y a une question au fond.
Thank you very much for your talk. That was very inspiring to see what can be done with imitating nature. I was just curious, as someone who practices yoga and someone who knows of other Eastern practices of imitating animals, I was curious whether she had any connection with, this other practices of imitating animal movement, because that seemed to be very, very well developed in yoga and other body practices. So just if you have anything to comment on it, that would be great.
Thank you. Simone, in the long conversations we had, she always mentioned that her intention is not that of imitating. She really wants to bring to her own body these postures and to understand anatomy, and less to mimic them. She has a very strong connection to two practices. One is somatics, and therefore the interest in the relationship between the spine and relationship between verticality and horizontality of the body. And what's really interesting in Simone's work, it's that it's not only this group of works, but in general, it's a choreography that is horizontal for a large space. Her and the dancers who work with her tend to spend a lot of time on the ground, on the floor. And the other is Tai Chi, which is a practice that she started doing later on in her life, from the 1990s onwards, and is more a correlation between breathing and a distension of time. And I think these two have I wouldn't say that have contributed to the development of this body of work, because they came in parallel or even later, but they certainly reveal these interests that she has on both modes of connecting, understanding how a body works, and also understanding how to go beyond the regular, let's say, temporality of modern dance and go beyond that. Yeah. There's another one there.
Merci beaucoup. Et on prendra une dernière question so that we can move in.
Thank you for your talk. And my question was about the audience and the gaze.
Do you mind standing up so that, sorry to interrupt.
Sorry. My question is about the gaze, and I think the zoos are a great and disturbing example how a material infrastructure can be like embodiment of objectifying gaze that transforms not only the way we perceive the animals, but also how animals behave. And maybe you ever spoke, like with Simone, or maybe from your own experiences, what is the position of the audience, of the observer, of the performers, of the performances? Is it something that's been considered? Is it something that kind of plays role, or is just the backdrop for the act itself?
In relation to her performances, you mean? So the only time, as far as I know, that these pieces or other pieces of her were performed at the zoo was on this occasion of the Serpentine Gallery, and the reptile room was beyond the zoo opening time, so the reptile room was empty. We also didn't want this spectacle of animals. No? We wanted to somehow bring a sort of exorcism to the zoo, but not having the animals there performing themselves. No. Something interesting is that Simone would call it dancing at the fence. She would go to the zoo as a spectator, and she would dance with these animals or for these animals, for the bears, for instance, or for the rhinos, trying to understand if they were interested in what she was doing or not. And if they were, she would continue. And many of the video pieces she made include the voices of spectators, in which you hear children making remarks or trying to attract there's a video, for instance, called 3 Grizzlies, where you hear school kids trying to attract the bears. So you hear all these common, very normal, let's say, responses of the audience to the animals. But just to go a little bit beyond what you say, what's interesting is that she is in fact very interested in spectatorship. And an early piece of hers, part of the dance constructions of the late 1960s, is a piece called Herding, in which she and other 3 performers, so it's on gallery space, so it's horizontal, and she and other 3 performers are moving the audiences around, herding them, until people understand what's happening and get upset or stop being herded, and then they stop. But this is how she was also considering the possibilities of, through movement, choreographing the bodies of the audiences who were in the space. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Filipa. A round of applause for Filipa, please. Yeah, what was interesting is that as you were finishing your talk, we could see you were kind of getting out of this kind of confrontational medium of the talk being given and using your body to present the gestures.